$3. That was all Abner Croft had left in his pocket when he heard the auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. But what he was about to be given with those 3 crumpled bills would change everything he thought he knew about right and wrong. The dusty main street of Dust Devil Gulch was buzzing with the usual Saturday crowd. Ranchers, miners, and drifters all gathered around makeshift stalls selling everything from cattle to mining equipment. Abner had come to town for supplies, nothing more. He needed rope, maybe some coffee if he had enough left over. His weathered hands gripped the reins of his horse as he surveyed the chaos of the weekly market. That's when he saw the crowd gathering near the old grain warehouse. Men were pushing forward, voices getting louder, excited. Abner had seen enough auctions to know the sound of bidding, but something felt different about this one. The voices carried an edge, a hunger that made his stomach turn. He dismounted and walked closer, his boots crunching on the dry earth. Through the gaps between shoulders and hats, he caught sight of what they were bidding on. A young Chinese girl, barely more than a child, stood on a wooden crate like livestock. Her black hair hung in matted strands around her face, and her clothes were little more than rags. But it was her eyes that stopped Abner cold. They held a terror so deep it seemed to echo in his chest. The auctioneer, a greasy man in a stained vest, was calling out numbers. The men in the crowd weren't looking at her face. They were looking at her like she was a tool, something to be used and discarded. Abner felt his jaw clench as he recognized some of the men in the crowd. Ranch owners who worked their hands to death. Mine foremen known for their cruelty. Bartholomew Kane, the wealthiest rancher in the territory, stood at the front, a cruel smirk on his face as he toyed with the bidding. His son, Jasper, a man known for his mean streak, stood beside him, laughing. The bidding stalled, and the auctioneer looked for a way to finish the sordid affair. That's when Jasper Kane's eyes landed on Abner, standing alone at the back of the crowd. A wicked idea lit up his face. "Give her to Croft," Jasper shouted, his voice dripping with malice. "He's the only man in Dust Devil Gulch lonely enough to want her." A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Men turned to stare at Abner, their faces filled with amusement and scorn. Abner stood frozen, the blood draining from his face. The girl's eyes found his, and a new wave of fear washed over her expression. The auctioneer, seeing a chance to curry favor with the Kanes and end the spectacle, slammed his gavel down with a sharp crack. "Sold." To the quiet rancher, Abner Croft, for the price of public amusement, he bellowed. The crowd roared with laughter again. Abner hadn't said a word, hadn't raised a hand, but he'd just become the owner of a human being as part of a cruel town joke. Every eye was on him, waiting to see what the old hermit planned to do with his prize. The girl was still staring at him, her body trembling. The fear in her eyes was now mixed with a profound sense of humiliation. Fear of him. The crowd was getting restless, nudging each other and pointing. Abner could feel their eyes boring into him as he stood there, paralyzed by the weight of what had just been done. The auctioneer jerked his head toward the girl. "She's yours, Croft. Got papers if you want them." He held out a crude bill of sale, ink still wet. Papers like she was a horse or a piece of farm equipment. That's when he felt a hand on his shoulder. Sheriff Thorne stood beside him, a man Abner had known since they were boys. Thorne's weathered face showed no emotion as he leaned in close. "This is a dirty business, Abner," he whispered. "What you aim to do?" Abner stared at the document, then looked back at the girl. She was trying to make herself invisible, her small hands clasped in front of her. The crowd was already losing interest, moving on to the next auction. Cattle this time, something normal. Abner took the paper, folded it, and stuffed it in his jacket pocket without looking at it. He approached the girl slowly, the way he might approach a spooked horse. When he got close enough, he could see the bruises on her arms, the way she flinched when his shadow fell across her. Someone had hurt her. Multiple someones, from the look of it. He stopped a few feet away and held out his hand, not demanding, just offering. "My name's Abner," he said quietly. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at his outstretched hand like it might be a trap. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. The words were so soft he almost missed them. Her English was broken but clear enough. "My name." Abner nodded and lowered his hand. "My. That's a good name." He looked around at the dispersing crowd, then back at her. "Are you hungry?" The question seemed to surprise her. She nodded once, quickly, like she was afraid he might change his mind. Abner gestured toward his horse. "There's a place across the street. We'll get you some food." But as they walked toward the restaurant, Abner noticed the stares following them. The whispers. A Chinese girl walking beside a white rancher meant only one thing to most folks in Dust Devil Gulch. And when they reached the restaurant door, the owner, a man named Grimes, stepped out to block their path. "We don't serve her kind in here," Grimes said, his arms crossed. "You'll have to find somewhere else." His eyes flicked to me with unconcealed disgust. "Maybe the back alley behind Chen's laundry. That's where they belong." Abner felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd been naive to think this would be simple. In a town like Dust Devil Gulch, there was no such thing as simple when it came to a Chinese girl and a white man. But he'd already come this far, and turning back now wasn't an option, not when he could see the resignation creeping back into Mai's eyes. The restaurant owner's words hung in the air like smoke from a bad fire. Abner stared at the man for a long moment, feeling the familiar anger that had gotten him into trouble before. He could walk away, take Mai somewhere else, keep the peace like he always did. Instead, he stepped closer to Grimes. "Her money's as good as anyone's," Abner said, his voice low and steady. "And since I'm paying, I reckon that makes it my money." Grimes, a thick-set man, didn't budge. "Don't matter whose money it is. I don't serve Chinamen in my place." Bad for business. He glanced around at the growing crowd of onlookers. "You understand, Abner? Nothing personal." But it felt personal. Standing there with Mai behind him, Abner could feel her shrinking back, trying to disappear again. The same look he'd seen on her face at the auction, like she expected the world to treat her as less than human. "Then I guess we'll eat somewhere else," Abner said, turning to leave. But Grimes's next words stopped him cold. "Might want to be careful, Croft. People are already talking. Questions about what a lonely old rancher plans to do with her." Grimes's smile was ugly. "Wouldn't want folks getting the wrong idea about your intentions." The threat was clear. In a town like this, a man's reputation could be destroyed by whispers and assumptions, especially when it came to a Chinese girl. Abner felt his fists clench at his sides just as Sheriff Thorne appeared beside them, seemingly from nowhere. "Problem here, gentlemen." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, but his eyes were sharp. "Because if there is, maybe we should discuss it at my office." Grimes's bluster deflated slightly. "No problem, Sheriff. Just explaining house rules to Mr. Croft here." Thorne nodded slowly. "House rules. I see." He looked at Abner, then at Mai, who was watching the exchange with wide, frightened eyes. "Well, as it happens, I know a place that serves excellent food to anyone with coin to pay for it. The Widow Gable's boarding house. She's got a dining room that's open to the public." It wasn't really a suggestion. Thorne's tone made that clear. Abner nodded and gestured for Mai to follow him. As they walked away, he could hear Grimes muttering under his breath, but the man was smart enough not to say anything loud enough for the sheriff to hear. The boarding house was only 2 blocks away, but it felt like the longest walk of Abner's life. Every person they passed stared, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed hostility. When they reached the boarding house, the elderly Widow Gable took one look at Mai, and her expression softened. "Poor child looks half-starved," she said to Abner. "I'll fix her up something proper." But as they sat down at a small table in the corner, Abner noticed the other patrons whispering and pointing. And through the window, he could see men gathering in small groups on the street outside. The kind of groups that meant trouble was coming. Mrs. Gable set down a plate of beef stew and fresh bread in front of Mai, who stared at it like she couldn't believe it was real. Her hands shook as she picked up the spoon. When was the last time someone had given her a real meal? She ate slowly at first, then faster, like she was afraid someone might take it away. The dining room had grown quieter since they'd arrived. Other patrons finished their meals quickly and left, shooting glances their way. Abner Mai's voice was so quiet he almost missed it. She was looking at him with those dark eyes. "Why you help me?" It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself since that gavel fell. Why had he accepted this burden? It didn't make sense even to him. "Don't know," he said honestly. "Just seemed like the right thing to do." She studied his face. Other men, they want different things. Her voice dropped even lower. "Bad things." "I'm not like other men," he said. Before Mai could respond, the front door of the boarding house burst open. 3 men walked in, and Abner recognized them immediately: Bartholomew Kane, his son Jasper, and Frank Morrison, who ran the mining operation east of town. They weren't here for dinner. Kane scanned the room until his eyes found Abner and Mai. His face was red with anger as he stalked over to their table. "Croft, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Abner set down his coffee cup carefully. "Eating dinner. You got a problem with that?" "My problem," Kane said, his voice rising, "is that you're parading this thing around town like she's a person, making every decent family in this town look like fools." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Mrs. Gable gasped. Mai's face went pale. Abner stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Watch your mouth, Kane." Jasper stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Or what, old man? You going to fight all of us over some yellow skin?" "I reckon," Abner said quietly, "a man's worth isn't determined by the color of his skin. Same goes for a woman." Frank Morrison laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "You gone soft in the head, Croft? Or maybe you just been alone on that ranch too long." His eyes flicked to Mai with disgust. "Either way, this ends now." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. But before anyone could draw iron, Sheriff Thorne stepped through the doorway, his boots ringing against the wooden floor. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I hope we're not about to have trouble in the Widow Gable's establishment." Kane turned to face the sheriff, his face still flushed with anger. "Thorne, you need to put a stop to this. Croft's brought shame on this whole town." Thorne's eyes flicked to Mai, sitting perfectly still, then looked back at Kane. "Last I checked, what a man does is his own business. Assuming it's legal, of course." "Legal?" Jasper spat. "What's legal about this?" "Well now," Thorne said slowly, "that's an interesting question. See, I've been doing some thinking about that auction, and I can't help but wonder where exactly did those folks who were selling her get the legal right to do so." The room went silent. "You thought you could buy and sell a human being like she was a piece of livestock," Thorne finished. "And now you're upset because Abner here has shown her some decency. Makes a man wonder what your intentions were." Kane's face was turning purple. "You can't seriously be taking his side in this." "I'm not taking anyone's side," Thorne said. "I'm just pointing out that if there's any crime being committed here today, it wasn't by Abner Croft." His hand rested on his gun belt. "Now, I suggest you gentlemen move along before I start asking more questions about that auction." Jasper looked like he wanted to argue, but his father grabbed his arm. "Come on," Kane muttered. "This isn't over, Croft." After they left, Thorne pulled up a chair. "They're not wrong about one thing," he said quietly. "This isn't over." Word spreading fast. "You got somewhere safe to take her?" Abner nodded. "My ranch. It's about 10 miles out." "Good. I'd get her there before dark." Thorne leaned forward. "But Abner, you need to understand something. What you did today, it's going to make enemies. People who want to hurt both of you just to prove a point." Through the window, Abner could see more men gathering in the street. The mob was growing. The crowd outside was getting uglier by the minute. Someone shouted about teaching lessons. Another voice called for running the Chinese girl out of town on a rail. Thorne stood and walked to the window, his face grim. "There's about 20 men out there now. You got another way out of here?" The widow Gable looked up from where she was frantically wiping down tables. "There's a back door through the kitchen. Leads to the alley behind the mercantile. We need to get to my horse," Abner said to Thorne. "Your horse is tied up right in front of that crowd," Thorne pointed out. That's when Mrs. Gable spoke up again. "My husband's got an old wagon behind the boarding house. Horse, too. Not much to look at, but it'll get you where you need to go." They moved quickly through the kitchen and out the back door. The alley was empty, but the crowd's voices echoed between the buildings. As Abner helped Mai into the wagon bed, she grabbed his arm. "What if they follow?" she whispered. "What if they come to your home?" "We'll face that when it comes," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Thorne appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face tense. "They're starting to spread out. You need to go now." Abner climbed into the driver's seat and took up the reins. As they pulled out of the alley, he could see the main crowd still in front of the boarding house, but smaller groups were breaking off. He spotted Jasper Kane leading one of them toward the back streets. They'd made it 3 blocks when Abner heard the sound he'd been dreading, hoofbeats, coming fast. He glanced back and saw 5 riders emerging from between the buildings. Jasper was in the lead. "There they are." Blake's voice carried across the dusty street. "Don't let them get away." Abner snapped the reins, urging the old mare into a faster pace. But the wagon was heavy, and the riders were gaining. The edge of town was still half a mile away. That's when he heard the gunshot. The bullet whizzed past his ear and splintered the wooden seat beside him. These men weren't interested in talking. They wanted blood. Abner pulled his own gun and twisted in his seat, firing once to slow them down. "Hold on," he shouted to Mai, then yanked the reins hard to the left. The wagon lurched off the main road and onto a narrow trail that led toward the rocky hills. The riders were having trouble with the terrain, but they were still coming. Abner spotted an outcropping of rocks ahead, a place where the trail narrowed between 2 large boulders. The wagon scraped between the rocks with inches to spare. As soon as they were through, Abner pulled the mare to a stop and jumped down, his rifle in his hands. "Stay down," he called to Mai. Jasper appeared at the mouth of the narrow passage. "You can't run forever, Croft. Send out the girl and we might let you ride away." "Go to hell," Abner called back, raising his rifle. Jasper's response was another gunshot. The bullet struck the rock near Abner's head. He fired back, and this time his aim was true. Jasper's horse reared, throwing the younger man to the ground. The other riders pulled back. But Abner knew they wouldn't give up. That's when he heard something that made his blood run cold. More hoofbeats, coming from ahead of them. They were trapped. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, Abner reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded bill of sale. With hands that weren't quite steady, he tore it into pieces and let the wind scatter them across the rocky ground. "What you do?" Mai whispered. "Setting you free," Abner said simply. "Really free. No papers, no ownership. You're your own person now." Just then, Sheriff Thorne's voice rang out across the rocks. "That's far enough, boys." Thorne and 3 deputies were riding hard from the direction of town. The riders who'd been approaching from ahead suddenly found themselves caught between Thorne's guns and the rocky outcropping. "Sheriff," Jasper called out, scrambling to his feet. "We're just trying to stop a crime here." "Funny thing about that auction," Thorne called back. "Turns out those folks selling her didn't have any legal right to do so, which means every man involved was participating in human trafficking. That's a federal crime, Jasper. Means federal prison." The blood drained from Jasper's face. One by one, his men began backing away. They'd signed up for intimidating a girl and an old rancher, not for facing federal charges. Within minutes, only Jasper remained. "This isn't over, Croft," he spat. "Yes, it is," Thorne said firmly. "It's over because I'm making it over." Anyone who bothers these folks from now on answers to me personally. Jasper glared at them all, then wheeled his horse around and rode away. Thorn dismounted and walked over to where Abner was helping Mai down from the wagon. "You two all right?" Abner nodded. "Thanks, Sheriff. Don't know what would have happened if you hadn't shown up." "Miss," Thorn said to Mai, his eyes kind. "You're safe now. And you're free. No one owns you, and no one has the right to hurt you." Mai looked up at Abner, then at Thorn, then back at Abner. For the first time since he'd seen her, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was real. "What happens now?" she asked. Abner looked out across the vast landscape toward his ranch. It was a big place, too big for one man. There was plenty of room for someone who needed a new start, a safe place to figure out what came next. "Now," he said, "we go home." 6 months later, Mai was running the most successful vegetable garden in 3 counties, selling her produce to the same stores that had once refused to serve her. But Abner knew true freedom required more than just the absence of chains. It required a name, a place to belong. He rode into town one morning and went straight to the courthouse. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, they would sometimes talk about that day in Dust Devil Gulch. The torn bill of sale was gone, scattered to the wind, but in its place was something far stronger, a legal document filed in the county clerk's office. Mai was no longer just Mai, a girl with no past and an uncertain future. She was Mai Croft, a name that carried the weight of protection, the promise of family, and the quiet dignity of a friendship that would last for the rest of their lives.